So in our What Should We Say class about apologetics, we are making our way first through these objections or attacks against Christianity and tailoring our responses to the attack and using those attacks as opportunities to break down barriers between people and the gospel. We began with the Bible is unreliable, and then last week we continued the next unit with the accusation that science proves the Bible wrong. I plan on spending today continuing that and then next time as well. And next time I'm hoping that we can give our attention mostly to observing inconsistencies in the worldview of people who have simply a materialistic view of the universe, because usually there are quite a few inconsistencies. And then how to use those as segues for the gospel. Today, where I'm planning on spending most of the time, isn't really in responding to materialistic atheists, but spending more time on the idea that the theory of evolution and the Bible are compatible, that they both can be true, which is an idea that seems to be quite popular in Christianity. I don't know if I would say that it's gaining ground or not. So to do some review from last time, let's say two people with identical intelligence and equipment explore the universe. So they go out up into space through their telescopes. They look down at the little things through microscopes and then report on what they find. And one guy says, well, my observation of the universe tells me that there is a creator. The observation of the universe is testimony to its creator. And that person's conclusions would be right in line with the conclusions that the Bible says that people draw. So, passage that we looked at last time, just real quickly. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. We noted the irony, right? Okay, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen. Well, how can you see something that's invisible? Because there's a footprint. If you see a footprint of whatever in the ground, you didn't see that thing make it, but you know that something was there, and you can tell things about whatever it was that was there. And the specifics that God tells us in this passage, you can clearly see God's eternal power. Whoever created all this, well, wasn't some insignificant weakling, but powerful and eternal. This gets us into ultimate causes. That everything that is cause has cause, and what is ultimately the first cause? The first cause has to be eternal. Here I'm speaking a little bit more in the philosophical, logical realm that philosophers concede quite easily, but that the Bible points us to as well. There must be some first cause, and what is it? A person can come to the conclusion, without looking at the Bible, simply by observing the universe, that there has to be something eternal. His eternal power and his divine nature, divine simply means God, that whoever did this is God, greater than all. So how can you see these invisible qualities? You can see them from what has been made. And as a result of that, people are without excuse. So the last day, Jesus comes back, and somebody says, but Jesus, I never knew there was a God. You didn't tell me. And he would say something like the other passage that we looked at. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they're pouring forth speech in words that can't be heard, but are still heard by all. It's not that there's any evidence, that there's no evidence, Jesus would say. It's that you denied it. Okay, so that's one guy that comes back from his telescope and from his microscope. Another guy comes back, and he says, no, The observation of the universe is testimony to the Big Bang and the evolution of the species. Looking at the same stuff. They have the same IQ level, the same resources available to them, but completely opposite conclusion. How can that be? If someone is beginning with the assumptions of the scientific method, there is no way that clinging to those assumptions they could ever grant that there's a supernatural creator. A list from a science website that gives some of the main beginning assumptions of the scientific method. It assumes that nature is orderly, and the laws of nature describe that order. Part of that is the assumption that, well, what can be tested through science? It's always samples, right? There's no way to observe everything that is right now, especially there's no way to observe everything that always has been. But you do enough tests, and you have your control groups and everything. Well, you can assume some things pretty strongly, so that when we get in an airplane and go speeding down the runway with trees at the end, we're pretty confident that before it gets to the end of the runway, it's going to go up in the air, because that's what's always happened when the pressure below is higher than the pressure above from the wings. It's built on the assumption that we can know nature. So those assumptions, then, we can observe them and know what's going on. Here's the big one. All phenomena have natural causes. If I'm starting with the assumption that everything has a natural cause, can I, by that method, ever to come to the conclusion that this must be supernatural? That's impossible. Which kind of makes me angry when people say there is no scientific proof of the supernatural, because that could never be using this method. Finally, nothing is self-evident, so everything needs to be tested, and that knowledge is derived from acquisition of experience. That person is beginning with different assumptions. A passage that would describe such a conclusion as that the God of this age has blinded the eyes of unbelievers so that they cannot see. If we just take like one thing apologetically from last class or from this class, that would be it. I think this is very helpful in understanding the when science and scripture supposedly come to loggerheads. That these are systems with two completely different assumptions. Yeah, Brian.
Can you go back to that list?
Uh-huh.
You say all of those are problematic, or is 3 really the one that...
Like, so if you're like a Christian scientist or like a Christian aerospace engineer, no, I wouldn't throw all those away. We're operating in a universe where God has designed things to work consistently, and largely in a way that we can kind of get to not the bottom of things, but maybe the functional bottom of things, that we can harness things and make assumptions that when we step on the sidewalk, we're not going to sink to the center of the earth and things like that. So these are all helpful, but with maybe adding generally to them.
Yeah. I think the first two, as far as witnessing, I just remember from freshman year physics, the textbook saying, the universe operates on laws that we can understand.
That we can understand?
That we can understand. And they said, that is a really profound truth that deserves some thought. And they didn't say anything else, but I think that was inserted by somebody who was either a Christian or theist. which galaxy you're in, the speed of light is the same. And we can understand these sometimes very complex laws. Why? What makes that true? Like if you think about it, how do we know that? We're saying, those first two are making metaphysical claims about the nature of reality that are really only grounded if God is the creator. Or you're just making unfounded, no, it's like this just because I say so. The universe is consistent and orderly, and we can comprehend it because I say so. How do you do that?
Okay. Could I rephrase what you're saying? That these laws aren't dictated by man, but they're observed by man?
And they're evidence of a covenant-making, covenant-keeping creator. That there's a mind, there's a being with a mind, and our mind is in some way like that mind. We can think after him.
Yeah, there are certainly there are certainly a lot of conclusions that one can rightfully draw about God based on such observation. I was just thinking of the covenant making and covenant keeping, if that can be drawn from nature. I have to think about that one.
I don't know if it can be, but I think that we know it. And just when we say orderly, why is it orderly? This law of nature holds today. Why should we say it will hold tomorrow? It holds here. Why should it hold in a totally different place?
Yeah.
And that's just more of a question for both, but I wouldn't expect somebody to reason from that to. It's just more like a question mark. These first two things should provoke questions in people.
Mm-hmm.
There's assumptions.
The fancy word for, and I think that this is what Brent is describing as the teleological argument, that I think otherwise known as the watchmaker or something. That if you're walking through the woods and you see a watch with all that the fine mechanics in it, that you are not going to assume that it just was always there together with the dirt and everything, but that there's a designer for it, and it's designed for a purpose. Good, thank you, Brent. Maybe a helpful way to remember it, we have the street light fallacy and the joke that goes with it. The story is that there's a drunk guy that is looking for his keys in the park at night, and a policeman comes up to him and he's like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm looking for my keys. And he said, well, so do you know that you dropped them here under this light? And he says, no, but this is where the light is, so I'm not going to go look in the dark. The assumption that I'm not stating it very well, that the universe, that what can be known must lie in the realm of what I can see. That's the assumption of all phenomena have natural causes. That I'm going to say from the start, that this is the only place that we're allowed to look. Okay, so where I'd like to spend at least maybe a half of our time today is the notion of having it both ways. That, well, we can see science has proven that the universe has come about through this cosmic explosion, and then through the evolution of species. So, okay, there's no question about that, but I still want to believe my Bible, so can I marry those two? That idea is called theistic evolution, that God created the world through evolution. So I'm going to run through just portions of this essay called Evolution and Genesis by Dr. Siegbert Becker, which this is a screenshot from the Google Doc resources thing that you can access from from the weekly reminder email. And if you click on here, then you can access the whole article. So, where the most obvious obstacle to harmonizing evolution and the biblical account of creation is Genesis chapters 1 and 2, specifically Genesis chapter 1, and it's saying that God created the world in 6 days. Okay, so that says God created the world in 6 days. How can I possibly harmonize that with the idea that the world is billions of years old and that man is many, many millions of years old? We talked about this last time. Someone might say, well, the word day doesn't always refer to a 24-hour period. Are they correct? Yes. Even in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, the word day doesn't always refer to a 24-hour period. God called the light portion day, and he called the dark portion night. Their day is referring to an approximately 12-hour period. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, when it says, at this, in English it's something like, at this time, God had not yet sent rain on the earth, but the streams froze up. The Hebrew word for that is day. In that day, at that time. So there you have day meaning more of an era. How do we know whether it's 12 hours, 24 hours, era? Well, you have to listen to everything else that the author says. That language always takes place in a context. So, how are we to understand these 6 days of creation? Well, in Genesis 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, 31, for each of those 6 days, it says, and there was evening and there was morning, the first, second, third, fourth, sixth day. Here's an explanation for that, though. Genesis 1 isn't really telling us how God created the world. It's telling us that God created the world. And it's doing through poetic license. Does that work? We're not to take it literally. Maybe this, that if God just wanted us to know that he created the world, why does he tell us how he created the world? Might be a good starting point. And then, maybe it'd be good to consider other parts of the Bible where God talks about that creative act. Let the Bible tell us what it means. Here, I think a helpful passage is, I always find myself picking on Claire, not that I'm picking on you, but that this is familiar to Claire because we just looked at the 10 Commandments in confirmation class. We read Exodus chapter 20, and we noted that the commandments, the first 3 commandments in the Bible, are longer than they are in the Catechism because the first, second, and third have these kind of explanations behind them in the text. So this is what God says when he gives the third commandment about the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. That means 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, a rest. And now he tells them why. Well, why 6 and then 1? He says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. He's talking to the Israelites about their week, and he compares their 7-day week to his 7-day week. This is the way that God did it, and this is the way that God tells you to do it. There's this direct comparison between the Hebrew week and God's week mostly before any humans existed. Which really kind of, that makes that difficult to say. Well, is God just referring back to something fictitious, which really isn't important, which is telling us how he created the world? It can't be. Okay, so that day thing is typically maybe like the easiest cherry to pick when it comes to addressing the idea of theistic evolution, but it's not even want to consider some of the other obstacles that you run into to keep on beating our heads against the Bible, trying to change it and start getting a headache. One is the biblical doctrine of man. And this deals with who are we? Here I'm kind of muddling, admittedly, theistic evolution and atheistic evolution. But when the way that God created people is a deliberate way of showing us who we are. When I teach creation and Jesus and me and in the youth confirmation class, I always try to emphasize that our origins are not only about how we got here. They're all about who we are. What does God say about humanity? So when he creates him in Genesis chapter 1, he has this conversation with himself. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And then he does it. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. What does that mean? Because, God doesn't have a body. Jesus does now, but not at this point in time. What does it mean that people are the image of God? It's not describing a physical attribute, but it's describing, first and foremost, a spiritual attribute. Adam and Eve didn't look like God, but they thought like God. Their will was in harmony with his. The New Testament makes big bones about this later on when it says that God restores the Christian to his image through faith. That what was lost at the fall was the image of God. And you think about God's creation. He puts everything in order before he creates the people. He creates the people very last as like a crown. That creation wasn't. They weren't for creation, but creation was for them. And he also gave them this work to do. Okay, have dominion over everything, reproduce, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it. God creates the world, and he decides that he isn't going to. Understand me, please. He isn't going to take care of it directly. He does. In these unseen ways. He's the one that keeps the laws of physics going. But he's going to take care of it through Adam and Eve and their descendants. So he equips them to do that by making them like him. Every analogy limps. Here maybe is maybe a way to consider the image of God. God created man to be in harmony with him. We're not complete unless we're with God. Morris, sorry.
Just a question about the translation. Is perhaps image a word that is like the best word in English that we have to describe the word is in Hebrew? Because the word image brings to mind a physical resemblance as opposed to what you're describing, which is a spiritual resemblance.
It is the word for image. I would have to. I wouldn't be able to tell you all the ins and outs of its usage, but it is giving us. It's giving us the same word that could be used to describe a physical resemblance. See?
Well, when God created man and woman, they were without sin, as God was. Is that fair to say that's what the image might be?
Yes. That is the heart and core of it. Some people, and that. You hit the nail on the head. That is the heart and core of it. Their thinking was in line with his thinking. Their will with his will. We don't even need to look at the New Testament don't go that far to see that, because in Genesis chapter 5, kind of takes us back to the beginning. It tells us that Adam had this kid, and then this kid, and then this kid, and everybody's living to be really old. Well, it starts out with God creating Adam in Genesis chapter 5. And it says, when God created man, he made him in his image, in his likeness. And then it talks about Adam having Seth. the one that replaced Abel. And it says, and Adam had a son named Seth in his image, in his likeness. So it draws that big distinction between the creation of Adam and then the begetting of the descendants. I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when people say, well, we're in God's image. As Christians, we're being restored to that image. Our hearts are being renewed. And maybe you could say that in a sense that our capacity to reason, the things that make us distinct from animals are also maybe to be included in that. But it seems to be thrown around as a given. We're in God's image, that all people are. I'd say in the truest, fullest sense of the image of God, I'm not really comfortable saying that.
Yeah, maybe just think that was God's intention for us, and that's how he created Adam. He wanted all of us to be in his image, but then sin broke that. So we were, with that intention. I guess that's one way to clarify it, kind of, and how we've been restored through faith.
So that's the biblical doctrine of man, of humanity. Now, in a materialistic, from that perspective, if we are the result of this cosmic explosion that over billions of years resulted in where we're at right now, what am I? I got a quote. I use this in Jesus and Me as well, so that may be familiar to some of you. This is from a Newsweek article 25 years ago. The author said, there's nothing predestined about our current preeminence among large terrestrial fauna. We are the product of a whole series of contingent events in the history of our planet, any one of which could have been reversed to give rise to a different outcome. Kind of high-level language. So there's nothing predestined, there's nothing, so predesigned, purposeful we might say, that humans are at the top of the food chain of creatures of animals that live on the earth, but we're simply the result of all of these events, each one dependent upon the others, and if any one of those events would have gone differently, then there would have been a different outcome. So his concluding statement is this: we are, in short, like every other creature that ever walked or slithered across the earth, an accident. I don't think that very many people would be comfortable putting that way. I've talked about the new atheists before that are like all over YouTube really promoting a materialistic view of the world. And even they kind of hedge a little bit when they say this. Where I see them, and the little that I've listened to usually going is you talk about meaning and what our purpose is, how we got here. Who says that there should be any? Or more of an existentialist bet that, no, meaning, don't think that's just got to be handed to you. You go find it. Find your meaning. But as far as the facts are concerned, he's being quite honest here. We're accidents. So do you see this big difference in what the Bible, with its history of our origin, tells us about who we are versus a materialistic view of the universe? And is that going to have, when it comes to the purpose of my life and the way I'm going to live, will that have bearing on it? If I'm a thinking person? Yeah. Okay. I'll try to pick up speed a little bit here. Evolution and what the Bible says about original sin. So, at the beginning, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And it was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. So, according to the biblical text, God is finished with everything, and it's all very good. Everything is absolutely perfect. So it's not this series of contingent events that is heading toward, ever more toward improvement or perfection, but rather it started out at the top. Romans chapter 12 comments on Genesis chapter 3 and the fall into sin. And it says, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all sinned. This passage tells us some big things about sin and about death. Namely, that they both came as the result of one person. So, before this, there was no sin and death in the world. It was after that that sin and death came in. So, according to this, is death natural? There's nothing natural about death. And when people say like death is just a natural part of life, so get over it. Oh, that's like a terrible thing to say. Death is painful, even for the Christian that has the hope of the resurrection. Death is not natural. But let's see. According to the biblical view, God created everything perfect. I'm talking about original sin here, I guess. That according to evolution, what's required for it to work? Death. Death is what weeds out the weaker, and lifts up the stronger. So death is the natural thing that builds us up, and sin. What do you make of the biblical account of the fall into sin? If we're the product of evolution, when did that happen? And how did that happen before death? Who were the Adam and Eve when they were all of these people, Homo sapiens, running all over the place? That's impossible for that to be a historic event as well. Paul in Romans 5 talks about that as being one of the two most pivotal events in the history of the world. He goes on to compare it with Jesus' death that brings life to all people. Rita?
Maybe even a little step below that is where did sin come in, but where did our recognition of sin come in? Where did our understanding that there is a right or wrong, and anybody who's more knowledgeable than I am could argue that we definitely, as a race, see a good and a bad, and where did that come
from? The theologians that believe in God, but it's not what he says, that will teach theistic evolution, I think will often refer to the fall into sin as mankind's becoming aware of right and wrong. So they would view the fall as a step up, not as a fall. Which really is, I hope we're seeing these two things do not go together at all, and it's not just how long a day is.
Would they attribute that to just as we evolve that our brains develop that capacity, or how would they just all of a sudden one day it was kind of like it evolved far enough that you could be aware?
That I have difficulty seeing how anybody can buy into this, but there, like an evolutionary biologist would say that morality is something that is wired into our DNA because these creatures that had a better concept of how to treat each other thrived more.
Yeah.
Where, you know how they used to talk about survival of the fittest? They don't say that anymore. If you know what you're talking about in the field, I don't want to pretend that I do. But you don't say survival of the fittest. You say natural selection, because they say that survival of the fittest gives the impression that it's like the brute beasts that survive better than anybody else. But it takes more than just being the strongest. You need to convince people to have kids with you. So you need to learn how to live harmoniously with people. And that's where morality comes from. When I look at the animal world or the human world, I don't see I don't see sex and reproduction something as always taking place in harmony between people. I don't mean to say it with snark either. Okay, evolution and death you kind of covered as well. Okay, last thing to walk you through this article is Genesis and the age of the earth. This would be the objection that, well, if you look at the world, it's obvious, like it has to be that it's super, super old. If you say that the earth is like 10,000 years old or less, you're a fool. In that video that we watched last week, that Dawkins guy says, like, do you really believe that the earth is less than 10,000 years old? If so, you must be a moron. Because look, oil, how did the oil get there? How did these rocks that are billions of years old get there? So my subtitle for this section is Genesis and the Age of the Earth, or Did Adam and Eve Have Belly Buttons? What do you think? You think they had belly buttons? Because they weren't born, right? They didn't spend any time in a mother's womb. The Bible doesn't say whether they had belly buttons. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. Let me change it a little bit. What would you find if you cut down a tree in the Garden of Eden?
Please say belly button.
That's where Adam's belly button was. Do you think you'd see that? Here's an easier. Maybe someone would say, oh, maybe not. It's just, I don't know, no rings. When Adam and Eve looked up at the night sky, what would they have seen? Would they have seen stars? How? If they're light years away, how could they see? But God says that the reason He put the stars in the sky was to mark seasons and days and years. If not, we still wouldn't be seeing stars now. And they could have seen the sun and the moon, because it takes like 8 minutes for the sun's light to get to Earth, but stars, far, far different. When they looked at the trees, well, when God created them, He said, you can eat fruit from any of these trees. How did the fruit get there? It would have been created that way, right? If you would be standing in the Garden of Eden, you'd probably be standing on, I don't know, nice fescue, probably 3 inches tall, nice and known. And it would look like, somebody must have planted that. You dig down, there's dirt. What does that come from? Like broken down organisms? We know that the earth was created with the appearance of age. Exactly, was that in every area? Like if you cut down a tree, I can't say for sure. But do our unproven methods of calculating the age of the earth, because you can't actually go back billions of years to see that, do they prove that it's billions of years old? And would people be saying the same thing if they were there on day 6? That's what I'm saying is I'm trying not trying to make a scientific assertion that the Grand Canyon was all the way carved out when on the day that God created the heavens and the earth. It's really in the realm of things that I don't know, but that certainly is a response that one can give to people who would say that those things are proof. Any questions on that, Rita?
Just a silly comment, a little bit like, I can remember it maybe a little bit like reality TV when they make the house party ready to move in.
it looks like,
The rings are already there, the fruit's already on the tree.
Oh, yeah.
And the house is already ready. It's all.
staging.
It's all done.
Yeah. We're gonna end up closing on this. I think I have a video that's coming up awful soon that we don't have time for. Last quote, second to last slide on this article. We are often told that if we insist on reading the Bible in this way, taking the words at face value, we will only make ourselves and our message ridiculous in the eyes of modern, educated people, and that if we want to win them for the church, we shall have to adjust our teachings to conform to the cultural patterns of the day and to the assured results of modern science. It's a mighty long sentence, but I think from a quick read we can get what he's saying. That it may seem to us, the temptation may be there, that in an age when people say, "Do you really believe that the world is 10,000 years old?" That if the church has any chance of surviving, that it needs to give in a little bit, and start marching to the drumbeat of everybody else. Is that temptation there for a church? Oh yeah. Look at mainline Protestantism. And the Catholic Church, fully given in on those fronts. He goes on. But such arguments always assume that if there is a conflict between the opinions of men and the teachings of the Bible, that it is the teaching of the Bible that stands in need of revision. Whereas we ought to remember that it is the evil, unbelieving heart of man that needs to be renewed, and the captive, blinded reason of man that needs to be enlightened. To unconverted man, the things that come from the Spirit have always been and will always be foolishness. He's talking about a rather narrow but very fundamental claim of the Bible. He's talking about the origins. We're talking about a couple chapters in Genesis. Maybe not too much if we give in on those. That is to forget the entire premise of God's revelation to man. The entire premise is that we're blind and broken, and the most pitiable thing about our condition is that we don't even know it. So what does God do? He intervenes by revealing himself, by revealing the truth. The purpose of the Bible is to change us. And if our approach is going to be that we need to change the Bible to fit us, then just throw the whole thing away because you're completely missing the point. He paraphrases 1 Corinthians 2:14, where Paul is making this point about the very crux of Christianity, which is Jesus on the cross. He says, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. And God gives us faith in that. We need to give him faith in that. That we are preaching a message that God has revealed to change people. And God sends his Spirit to change people. If we think that just can't happen, if we give up, there's some evidence that we can point to, some real concrete evidence. And that's us. If God could change my heart to believe what goes against the grain of my natural heart, that's evidence that God can do that for somebody else too. Amen. Our origin doesn't only tell us how we got here. Here's the video. You may be You may be familiar with these names. Neil deGrasse Tyson is an astrophysicist that is very popular. He can speak at a popular level. And then Ben Shapiro. It's not a debate. It's simply a conversation. But Neil deGrasse Tyson, he explains where our purpose is and where our meaning is. So that's what I hope to show you next time. And so I've learned a little bit from the 10 for 10 materials in that Bible study that we've been doing after church, that those fill in the blanks things. So I had some of those like really fun fill in the blanks things. So anyway, we are at the end of our time. So I thank you all for listening to me today and participating. Let's close with prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, teach us our value. That we're not accidents. That when people turn their backs on us, people that we look to for hope, that betray us, and it seems like no one else considers us of any worth. Teach us our value. You showed us our value in the way that you created us in your image. You showed us our value doubly than when you gave yourself to redeem us and to restore us to rightness with you, and what you promise us will ultimately be a restoration of everything in this universe to rightness with you. Then we'll see our value. But for now, teach us to find our value in the pages of Scripture, in your promises. Amen.